And I'd really like to welcome everyone today, and I'm delighted to be here today to talk to Louise Broekman, the founder of the Advisory Board Centre. I'm going to do an introduction of Louise in a moment because we've got some admin to get through, but we've been tracking this State of the Market report since its inception 6 years ago, and it's been fascinating to watch the growth of the Advisory Board over that time. The report happens every 2 years. It's the third biennial State of the Market report. And what we'll see today as we go through is really the evolution, the maturity and the normalisation of advisory boards. So I recall, Louise, when we were sort of talking probably 6 years ago now, it was sort of still a new concept and we were explaining what an advisory board was. So it feels like we've come a long way from there. The report was released 3 weeks ago, so hot off the press, getting a lot of global attention. And we'll talk about Louise travelling the world to deliver training and advice on advisory boards throughout today. I'm Jacinta Whelan. I'm a partner in our Melbourne practice, and I'm joined by all the partners from Watermark today, and we will welcome you. We've got partners from the board practice, the search practice, and the interim practice. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we all work today, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar particularly. As always, we're delighted to deliver this webinar series to you. What we look for is topics that are pertinent to you and your portfolio career. And the topic of advisory boards is pertinent for two key reasons, really. One, more and more organisations are putting them in place. So we want to understand what that looks like, the frameworks and the reasons why. And for a lot of people we talk to, an ideal mix for their portfolio would include some advisory boards. So how do we go about that? How do you understand where that's at and the governance and frameworks around it? So two really important reasons for us to chat. Before I get on to talking through with Louise, feel free to use the chat, ask questions. We'll be monitoring that, and some of the team are monitoring that. We'll see if we can get to that at the end, because there's always some really good questions that pop out of this. The session will be recorded and it will be made available on various socials. So you can't see any faces today, but just letting you know that. Now, if I can introduce Louise and the Advisory Board. The Advisory Board Centre is the leading professional body for the advisory sector. Their mission is to raise the standard of the global advisory sector through training and professional development. And the founder of that organisation is Louise Broekman, who we've got today. Louise is an award-winning entrepreneur, researcher, business advisor with industry and government. And she has a unique advantage of coming at this from both sides of the table. She was the founder of a business that required a chair and some advisory boards, and that led her post her own business to really establishing this organisation. Louise recognised firsthand how a well-run advisory board can positively impact CEOs and the business at large. Upon exiting her multinational business, Louise served as the chair for commercial advisory boards before starting her second business. And as the founder of and CEO of the Advisory Board Centre, Louise facilitates leading education programs for incredibly ambitious, progressive and committed advisory board members, supporting their professional development and in turn the businesses they serve. Louise spends about 6 months of the year travelling the world, delivering these training programs and sharing best practice with many of the world's leading organisations. 1 week she's in Silicon Valley with a room full of the CEOs of the big brands and the names we all know. And the next she's in the Middle East and then popping across to Europe. We'll share more about what Louise is seeing across the advisory and governance frameworks in those countries, because it's really interesting. But before we get to Louise, we've got 2 poll questions that we really want to sort of just set the scene and see for the people on the call, where are we at? And that will sort of then help Louise and I have a really good discussion as we jump into the data. So Ali, if you might be able to raise the 2 questions. We're going to ask people, are you currently on an advisory board? Give people just a minute and then we'll start to see the data. So 74% of people are not on an advisory board and 26% of people are. A quarter of people, that's interesting. The second question is just to see whether you are interested in being on one, which I think might probably be higher numbers. Did we get there? 98% of people looking to be on an advisory board. 2% are here for the canapes. Let's go. Louise, over to you.
Thanks, Jacinta, and it's lovely to do this with you again. I think you could probably share the do this presentation for me, actually. But I really appreciate the synergy that we have in supporting people in their portfolios, Jacinta. So thanks to Watermark for this. I'm just going to get straight into it. The advisory board profession has more than 5 times grown over more than 5 times in the last few years. So when we first started tracking the advisory board sector in 2019, there were 1.3 million advisory board professionals. Today, there's over 9.8. And it's around the world. And what we're seeing is a normalization of advisory boards across all markets. Now, traditionally, the US market's been the largest. It still is, but there's really an emergence of advisory boards in emerging economies. And I just want to particularly point out key markets of where we're seeing growth. We're seeing still growth in the Australia-New Zealand market, so it's grown 1% just in this last 2 years. In Asia and in particular in Singapore, in India for the first time is showing up, and the Middle East as well. And also there's a growth in the UK European zone. So this is not now something about it's a nice to have. It's something that we all need to really recognise the profession and where it fits into a system of governance, but also where it fits in for professionals into their broader portfolio as well. So the advisory board sector is not a fad. It's here to stay. What I do love, and I'm going to look at, data and information about the sector, but before we do all the stuff about the head, what's going on in the market, I want to talk a bit about the heart of the advisory board sector. 98% of organisations are choosing to be optimistic about the future and using advisory boards to navigate the future and be proactive about it. Even if they're going through difficult times, they are choosing to be proactive in the way that they approach the future. And I think that's really pretty wonderful. The other side
lines up nicely with our 98% who want to be on a board.
Exactly.
It's a lovely stat.
Yeah. Well, and that goes in line, Jacinta, with the individual professionals, where the number one motivation for people to be on advisory boards is people are wanting purpose and meaning in their work and the way that they can contribute their skills and experience. So Jacinta, I think that alignment is something really special around shared values.
And that purpose and meaning, Louise, we're about to release our interim survey, the 15th year, and purpose and meaning has been the theme for a while, but it feels like it's just gaining momentum the whole time. Who doesn't want to do meaningful work and turn up somewhere that has impact every day? And we're only going to see that continue. So yeah, we know there's an alignment between all the people, and I think one of the reasons we're here today is the pool of people who are looking for advisory boards and the interims, they are the same people. So we're sort of circle the same wagon of the people. So it doesn't surprise me that the values align there as well.
Yeah, no, that's great. So let's get into the head stuff, what's actually going on. As you mentioned, Jacinta, our role as the global professional body is to raise the standard of advisory boards. So if you get involved in it, you're doing it well, and really driving value for not only individual professionals, but then in turn the organisations themselves. Our key role is around research education, the professional development, but also the advocacy for what best practice as well as ethics what that looks like, where it's becoming more and more important around the ethical boundaries around the role and function of advice. The State of the Market report is run by our Global Research Council. I am the chair of the Global Research Council, and there's a lot of different data points that we look at as the foundation of this report. So it's not the world according to me. It's information and data that's being gathered by organisations, by individual practitioners, as well as other sources in academic journals as well. The report, since the last report in 23, the State of the Market's been referred to by both Korn Ferry and Financial Times, as well as other organisations, as well as being a hot new governance trend. And the governance trend where we are shifting about talking about governance systems, which the 2023 report first really raised the term around governance systems. This report, we're now really seeing that real shift of how governance systems actually work. We're talking about integrated governance systems where advisory boards are actually becoming the norm. So I'll go into that in a little bit of detail. So the State of the Market report itself is this year talking about the art and the science of advisory boards. Now, very often we talk about the art of the advisory board and how an individual will use their skills and experience within best practice frameworks. That's the art of the individual. Now we are also talking about the science. How do you actually drive value from within the organisation on how advisory boards are being managed by internal practitioners as well? And this is an absolute shift in the way that advisory boards are being viewed, as well as the way that they're being managed. So I'm going to look at just some key information, and then we'll move into lots of questions, hopefully, in the conversation. You, Jacinta, wanted to talk about the evolution of the sector, the business case of advisory boards. What are the mega trends that are driving the advisory board sector for 2027, and what's happening with the strategic advisor and how people are managing portfolios. So the sector evolution, the time of saying I'm an advisor, I'm a portfolio professional, and I'm just going to add advisory boards into my portfolio and just make it up as I go, that time has really changed. There is a demand in the market because advisory boards are now working more and more within a governance system that we know what we're doing, and we are playing absolutely clear, have clear intention about what the advisory board is, as well as paying attention to the detail. And I think this is now the stepping up of the advisory board sector, that we are professional in the way that we actually operate and sit and manage advisory boards themselves. So let's look at the evolution. Advisory boards are engaged within the advisor engagement model. This is a really well-known model that's been around for many years. So from an informal level to formal levels of engagement of external advisors, from informal of peers in business network groups, through to one-on-one engagement of individual advisors, consultants, specialists, then advisory boards, and then governance boards being the most formal level of engagement. The market generally don't know the difference between advisory boards and governance boards. So if we look at that, the foundations to this conversation today, it's well known that governance boards are decision-making models where it's binding, where a governance board director can go to jail for the decisions that are made or not made, but it's also binding on the organisation to implement based on the decisions that are made at the governance board table. We need to have a very clear line between what a governance board is and what an advisory board is, and not a porous line. An advisory board is a problem-solving model where they are road testing ideas, conversations, pulling apart strategy to inform the strategy. So the advisory boards do not make decisions. They inform the decision makers. And that's really important where that line is between the two. Especially when the title and the name of an advisory board is interchangeable. An advisory board can be called lots of different things. But we try and keep it as simple as possible so there's a very clear line between the two functions, especially as they're starting to work together more frequently. So that's a really important, but a very simple definition.
What else might an advisory board be called if people are out there in organisations?
Yeah, lots of different things, and I'll get to that in a moment,
Yep.
because it's exciting actually the way that they're
Mhm.
being used and the title being changed.
Yep.
If we look at the foundation to still the most common structure of advisory boards is just been, it's just really strong, and it's really being maintained, especially around strategic advisory boards where it's constant. Two internal representatives, an independent chair, and two external members. And still the most common model for strategic advisory boards is the advisory board meets on a quarterly basis, but the chair works on a retainer on an ongoing basis. The chair also does the establishment phase of an advisory board, which could take a month, it could take 12 months to establish the advisory board, depending on the complexity of the situation that they're in. So that's the still the constant foundation to the advisory board sector. The evolution in the structures is not only the structure, but the titles. So advisory boards can be informal, but they can also be formal. So informal, where you might have on-demand advisor panels, which are commonly used by investment groups, governments, accelerator programs, very flexible and very agile. Peer advisory boards where you've got one chair and you've got multiple businesses or multiple executives around the table. So we're seeing peer advisory boards being used more and more in corporate environments, which is pretty exciting. The advisory board of one is the model that we saw traditionally being used in an organisation when they've never had an advisory board before. And they start with the chair with an advisory board of one, and then they grow into best practice over time. There's actually an evolution in that particular role that I'll talk about a little later, because there's a lot of exciting things happening in that particular model itself. A pop-up advisory board is when they have an independent chair that's working as an advisory board of one, and then they bring in advisors as they need. So they pop in and they pop out. So the business sector and scale-up businesses really like the agility of a pop-up advisory board. It's a lot of fun and it's really exciting. Project advisory boards is where the market is today with regard, and it's the future of the advisory board sector. Whether you like it or not, it is. So 53% of new advisory boards are project advisory boards. So the advisory board in this space is they're not talking about the strategy, they're talking about individual strategies. And in a moment, I'll talk about some of the research that we've done in family businesses. They're actually giving us a line of sight on 5 key type prototypes of project advisory boards. Then you get the advisor to the board that comes into the governance board to inform the governance board. And then the final one, which is the strategic advisory board, where the advisory board there is to talk about the strategy when they don't have a strong governance function in place. And that's the model that we just looked at on the previous slide. Now, with the evolution of structure also comes the evolution in the title of an advisory board. They could be called lots of different things. Now, for everyone on the call, you might look at this and really reflect on, you might have been involved in an advisory board previously and actually didn't know that you were part of an advisory board. And again, the definition is an advisory board is not a decision-making model, it's a problem-solving model. So the titles could be an advisory council, a panel, a committee, reference group, working groups, project advisory board, or a think tank. And so very often we're seeing organisations evaluating, do we need an advisory board? And sometimes there's pushback and saying, oh no, we don't need another board. We are the board. We're the board. And then we see this in Malaysia, actually, with a few different case studies where they say, okay, let's not put together an advisory board, let's put together a working group to really focus on this. And the response has been, that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
What have you seen, Jacinta?
Yeah, I think a lot of people on the call, you rightly said, sort of go, oh, I'm already doing this. And that's, that's almost the evolution of interim as well, where in the absence of the formal structures,
Mm,
these sort of organisations self-solve to some degree, and they sort of self-form. And I think what we're seeing here is everyone go, oh, that makes so much sense. I hadn't seen it set out like that, or I hadn't seen it as that term.
mm.
So that's what I'm seeing when I see that people here have probably said, yeah, and that's I've been on one.
Yeah, yeah. It's a thinking system. So what are
Mm,
the protocols around that thinking system then to maximize the impact of it?
mm,
Yeah. Um, Now, the governance dilemma was first introduced in 2023, where we saw the role of advisory boards being used more in systems of governance because governance board members are increasingly under constraint
mm,
and personal liability of a board member. And we're seeing governance boards around the world getting smaller because of it, but the agenda is getting bigger. And so having, a 900-page report for governance board directors to navigate it every month is not uncommon. And so how do they deal with that, where they're increasingly becoming constrained and under the microscope, but their agendas are getting bigger? Do they work
mm,
longer hours? Does their governance board get bigger and add more directors that are more specialised? Do they bring in employees, consultants, committees, advisory boards, or do nothing and hopefully no one notices? Now, advisory boards is just a potential opportunity to be able to help solve this governance dilemma. It's not the only one, but
mm,
it's where we're seeing advisory boards being used more and more. And what's happening in this is that shifting the narrative from being a governance board, 2023, we're talking about now the function of a governance system. In 25 to 27, we're now talking about an integrated governance system when a governance board or an executive team are using an advisory board to inform the decision-making process. And if a governance system is being established using external thinking to support the internal decision making, it needs to be done really well, right? So the structure, the management function of it, the protocols that sit around managing a governance system is really important for all the different stakeholders, including the governance board, the executive, the advisory board itself, as
mm.
well as external consultants and external stakeholders. So if it's going to be done, do it really well.
Do it well. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. Now, a study that we did over the last 12 months, which was on the use of advisors and advisory boards in families in business. Now, families in business include family office as well as family business, and family office is a big, it's a growing demand in Australia where family businesses are becoming investment houses, but it's massive worldwide.
Yeah.
And through this 12-month study, we're actually seeing how families and businesses use advisory boards and advisors, and is actually helping us to really frame out the 5 different areas of specializations of advisory board. Now, the first 3 is traditionally where advisory boards are being used. In stewardship, when you're dealing with other people's money and you're
Mm,
trying to also delegate and managing the agenda of legacy. So advisory boards under stewardship are around accountability and building excellence, building capability and succession inside organizations to validate strategy, but then also what is the long-term legacy. So families in businesses and family offices, stewardship is a very important piece.
mm,
Then we get the traditional part of the market of commercial advisory boards. Now, in 2019, we saw that 75% of businesses had an advisory board because they were focusing on growth strategies. Now it's 50%. It's not that not that growth strategies have diminished, but also commercial advisory boards are now trying to also navigate change and trying to deal with the now, let alone what's next. So commercial advisory boards are around strategy and growth. International markets is one of the biggest areas of advisory boards in the current market, trying to navigate geopolitical risk. Um, Investment, mergers and acquisitions, and commercialization strategies. So this is a very traditional, very important part of the advisory board sector. Then navigating change. We're actually supporting two international investment funds at the moment, trying to navigate change. And the area around transformation, organisational development is being a really big, important part of that, because it's not just to say, this is the strategy, but then they're focusing on what is our actual ability to be able to execute on that. So these three areas are very traditional, very important parts of the advisory board sector. We are now entering into the part of the market where the other two areas now are going to be probably driving the growth of advisory boards worldwide, and in particular in corporate environments. So specialised advisory boards, AI, digital transformation is one of the biggest areas of advisory boards today, and especially project advisory boards. Cyber, specialist technical panels like hydrogen advisory boards, sustainability, and ethics. There's a growth in the use of ethics advisory boards worldwide, and all these emerging technologies. What are the ethical challenges that are being addressed from that? So specialist areas, and I'll talk more about that in a moment as well. Jacinta, have you seen a growth in the areas of specialisation as well?
The digital cyber, that specialist area you've got there, when we're talking to clients, that is their challenge. That's the projects, that's what they're borrowing talent for, to help them work through that.
Yeah.
So while you're seeing it at that sort of the governance layer, our work probably sees it at the executive, and no surprises, right? It's the biggest thing going around that everyone's trying to work through. So
Yeah.
Great to see that the same issues are being worked through and put into the right frameworks at all levels.
Yeah, yeah. And these advisory boards could be anywhere inside the organisation. So it could be supporting the executive. We're seeing it in the recruitment space. So I was in London last week. We were looking at this board and executive recruitment firm, and they say, when we do the recruitment piece, someone might have 60 or 70% of the job capability. What is it we're going to do to be able to support the building up of that capability really fast? And so they're building advisory boards into supporting these executives, either the new recruit or somebody, if they've built somebody up internally, they're building these advisory boards to really build up that capability. That's a really capacity building strategy that we're seeing there as well.
And the skills needed, no one's got. So it's not like you can, we need to support, and that 60, 70%. I love hearing that people sort of are open to, we know you don't have everything, because that's real. No one has everything. How do we support and help people be successful? Let's borrow in some capacity what we need to help that person be successful.
Exactly. And not just one voice, because that's dangerous, right? And so how is it that everyone's feeling confident about it? So if you've got a specialist advisory panel or an advisory board to support that, you've got that different thinking and problem solving and escalating everybody's conversation, where it de-risks that strategy overall. Then the last group, which is around stakeholder engagement, and we're certainly seeing this a lot in governments around the world, and multinationals. So next generation advisory boards, diversity, really big in the UK, European zone, customer advisory boards, which is big everywhere. And we know in Australia, the mandated advisory boards in the aged care sector is certainly driving more customer-based vulnerability, customers that are vulnerable, advisory boards in that space, consultation at a sector level, as well as thought leadership pieces too. So 5 very different sort of mandates that we have and getting more of a clarity around that area of specialisation. What's interesting though is the rise of specialisation is actually giving rise to the generalist.
Our data's we're just doing our data for the survey as well, and some of that's coming through also. So bring it on.
Yeah, that's great.
Mm,
And in the advisory board space, when you've got specialists, so we look at that specialization advisory boards, like a cyber advisory
yep,
board,
yep.
or something that's around a specific topic, especially hydrogen. So just
Mm,
imagine you've got a
mm.
hydrogen advisory board. What's really important is that the chair is not a specialist. So that way you
They're the
manage
generalist. Okay,
the
yeah, that's
generalist.
yeah.
So you're managing that ethical boundaries
Mm.
around bias and translation. It's an important balance. It also individuals when for those of you on the call that you say in some spaces I'm a specialist, but in
Yeah.
also other areas that I'm not. So I'm a generalist in that space, but I'm a specialist in this space. So it gives a different way of being able to add value and being consumed.
What I would say about that generalist space, because for the most part, the executives we talk to, are very proud of being a generalist because they've risen and they've got generalist leadership skills. And being a generalist, you still need to be able to articulate the value you bring
Yeah,
because being a generalist as a general statement is a bit too bland and a
yeah,
bit too broad.
yeah.
So, in what value as a generalist do you bring? So, in your instance, it might be I am the chair of the committee
Mm.
in with a sector experience. So you've still got to have something to pin. Being a pure generalist is we can't just pin ourselves on that without something that's of value underneath it. There's got to be some depth to that.
There's got to be depth. And the two areas of depth that we're seeing
Mm.
generalists is they must have a high level of commercial acumen
Yep. Again,
and
everyone will tell me they've got that, so they've got to be able to demonstrate it.
demonstrate it. That's
Yep.
right. And
Perfect.
demonstrate
Yep.
currency around that, as
That's
well as
it.
being an expert facilitator. So you've got to be able to draw out and bring out the best out of other people, not just yourself.
Which is very different than the pure executive who is delivering and executing.
Yeah.
This is the facilitation and the harnessing of the knowledge and the ideas and the solution.
And the science,
Yeah.
the absolute science of it, and the shaping of an agenda, the shaping of a
Mm.
conversation, knowing and preparing for these advisory boards, preparing the organisation, preparing the advisors, and then being absolutely present in that market and being
Mm.
on your A game in those meetings, as well as being able to follow through internally inside the organisation, is an absolute must today, especially in these governance systems where you've got to know what you're doing because you create chaos if you don't.
And so the real sort of, if people need to flex a muscle to be doing this, what could they do? The skill they could learn is facilitation to add
Yeah,
to their little bag of tricks of what else they've got. Okay.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's been a lot of our research is actually looking at what drives expert facilitation. Just in the last
Mm.
2 years, we've been prototyping and testing and validating different types of models for different environments. It's been actually really interesting seeing that evolution. Part of that evolution is the recognition of the internal roles. And so
Mm.
traditionally we think about advisory boards as being the people at the table. So you've got internal representatives, you've got external advisors that come in and the chair, and you've got the conversation at the table. What's been really important in the recognition out of the research in the last 2 years is the role of the sponsor. Who is the champion? Who is the power base inside the organization? The secretariat, what is the management function, what happens before the meeting, what happens in the meeting, and what happens afterwards to amplify. And then the chair, which is the influencing factor. And so those three roles need to be absolutely aligned. And that's what we call the golden triangle. And the importance of the alignment of those three roles to really drive value at the advisory board table and then after the advisory board meetings. So this is a real shift in the way that we view the profession,
Yeah.
recognition of internal executives.
So in that golden triangle there, where is the advisor sitting? Because they've got to,
The advisor at the advisory board table is at the table.
yeah, yeah,
Yep. So they get bought in to the
yep,
organisation and then they
yep.
leave. The organisation needs to again coming through to what's their ability to be able to execute that, which is why the formation of the agenda and preparation is really important. Why have a conversation about something that the organisation's actually not ready for or haven't got the capability to be able to do something with it? And so if you're going to maximise the value of it, it's got to be the chair needs to know what they're doing and know the organisation itself to be able to absolutely drive value from that table. So the ability to execute is, I'm actually writing something separate to the state of the market report and trying to make that really, really succinct because this is really important in being able to have an impact. Everybody feeling valued from the advisory board conversation itself.
I love that, then you've got to do something with it, right? That's the age-old problem. It's great to talk about it. But this secretariat sponsor piece where how do we influence how it rolls out, how it's communicated?
Yeah. Yeah. So in this environment, people know that people on the call that have been in conversations with us previously. The ABF 101 Best Practice Framework was released in 2020. It's so critically important. We do a refresh of that every year. It did a refresh with the Best Practice and Ethics Advisory Board. It's a global advisory board. They oversaw the ongoing development of that. So it's had a refresh, but the five key principles remain really strong in whatever environment it's in the emerging sector, the business sector, and corporate. That there's real clarity of scope around purpose. There's structure and discipline without constraint, and measurement of impact, which is around process, and then independence and fit for purpose around the people element. And when we look at independence globally, the advisor sector itself, not just advisory boards, but the whole advisor sector, we all need to do better with regards to independence and managing conflicts of interest. So this is really important in the establishment of advisory boards, is considering these best practice principles.
Louise, there's one question that's come through. If we go back to that golden triangle, the sponsor piece, what level of who's typically a sponsor? So is that like the CIO sponsoring a program and the external advisors giving advice, but the chair? So what level does that sponsor usually sit at?
Could be at the board level. It could be at the CEO level. And CEOs are more and more having their own advisory boards. And it could be at an executive or at a project level. So it could be anywhere of those. So the sponsor, what's really important that we know in corporate environments is making sure that the sponsor actually has the authority.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
We've got lots to get through, so we'll see. I'll just keep a bit of an eye on the questions as we go.
Yeah, thank you. I'll dive through the rest of it.
Yeah.
The market demand is across all parts of the market, and the big shift in the market is the corporate sector, where it's now taken over being the largest part of the sector from the business sector. Business sector is still large, but corporate is just getting.
It's got real legs, hasn't it? Because I remember the years ago that emerging people use these startups. Rather than a governance board, sometimes they had a bit of an advisory board and didn't want the formality.
Yeah.
So, gosh, yeah, that is a big shift.
It's a big shift in a very short period of time. Families in business in the business sector, 33% of advisory boards are in families in business. So a really important part of the market. But there is no one model for families in business because there's always unique requirements around alignment of their own priorities. Yeah. If I just go to the mega trends in today's market, the three key things that are driving advisory boards in the next 2 years is integrated governance systems, if we've talked about it. If they're going to be put into a governance framework, do it well. Informed leadership. So the hallmark of a trusted leader is their ability to be able to be informed. That's one of the key messages that we have in the market today. So it's not showing that you're a weak leader because you have an advisory board, because you don't know what you're doing. It's actually, it demonstrates strength to others to feel confident in your leadership and the decisions that you're making, because you are demonstrating how well you're being informed. And the last one is the real challenge where we're seeing a rise of project advisory boards that for the professional, we have to be really careful that advisory boards are not just short term, which addresses not just what's next, but what's now, but we don't lose sight of longer term strategy as well. So we need to really make sure there's a very good balance between short term, as in addressing that, as well as keeping an eye on longer term agendas as well.
Yeah, I love that middle one there, the informed leadership, because there's some other commentary coming out that's saying the younger generation don't necessarily want to be the boss because there's so much pressure and there's so much change and how do you possibly juggle all the balls that are in the air? And so being able to show vulnerability in that by saying, yes, I'm the boss, but I've got these inputs of, someone who guides me on cyber and someone who guides me on, because I can't possibly know all this, it's moving too quickly.
Yeah.
So that's framed that up, that conversation a little bit more about how we might address what do leaders need to help them be the best they can be.
Yeah. And it
Mm.
gives an agile nature to governance.
Mm.
Modern governance
And
is
modern leadership as well.
modern leadership. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's and the work that you're doing, Jacinta, with the report that's coming out, I'm looking forward to seeing that because the use of interim, the use of advisory, is going to reshape organisational design in the future without a doubt. Now, given the evolution in the role of advisory boards and what's happening with the internal function, it's also creating an evolution in the role of the chair. And now we're seeing the chair being the trusted advisor, and the title of a chair is interchangeable. So we're seeing strategic advisor or a chair in residence or a chief advisor, which is a title that's used in the US. The role of the chair and the title of the chair is evolving and becoming longer and deeper in their relationship with the organisation. And so the trusted role of the chair means that their engagement pieces are getting longer and their retainers are becoming broader than just managing advisory board meetings. And this is now normalising the role of the chair, where advisors may come and go, but the chair is becoming a constant about managing the advisory board strategy and the advisory strategy, because most organisations are generally not sophisticated in the way that they manage their external advisors. So this is a big evolution, small in what it looks like, but it's actually a very big change in the sector
And
itself.
I would imagine then, because you've spent the time to set the framework and the governance around what an advisory board does, rather than have to do that every time and reset it up, you plug back in the next problem or the next thing you've got to, but you've got that
Exactly.
constant. And when we were sort of preparing for today, when you say extended tenure, is that a couple of year tenure? What does that look like? Did you?
10 years or more, we're seeing. And this is from what we saw from this research we did in families and business and how they actually work with advisors. Now that it's a good opportunity, but it's also problematic around over familiarity,
Independence, probably.
independence,
Yep.
conflicts of interest.
Mm.
But the rise of the generalist chair enables that chair to then chair multiple advisory boards at the same time or at different times. And so you don't just talk about what's your advisory board or chairing one advisory board. You're actually looking at what is your advisory board strategy. So you might be chairing an advisory board around succession planning here, maybe chairing an advisory board about a particular project over there. And that means that you're able to integrate best practice across their whole strategy without creating a lot of noise. And where this shifts in the role of the chair is the chair then becomes protects the client and then connects the client. So a lot of organizations saying we don't want the noise with lots of different moving parts. So we want the chair to be really well connected to be able to support the management of the external advisors, not be part of the selection process though, but actually manage that noise on their behalf. So it's a bit of rethinking about that role,
Mm.
but a very important shift.
And then some of the questions coming through are around that sort of the governance of those decisions. So again, the advisory board solves the problem. So in terms of them recommending, that still goes to the board, the governance board, for them to decide if this is the action we're going to take. Is that right?
Or to the executive. So, for
Yep.
example, we're supporting a $5 billion investment fund where they're putting advisory boards over each of their investments. The advisory boards are there to support the executive, to build stronger business case back to the governance board. So the advisory board is there to support the capability and capacity building of the executive. So they're road testing their ideas and making sure that they're presenting stronger business cases back to the governance board. So yes, it could be at any of those levels. Yeah.
Yep.
Strategic advisor, and sorry, Jacinta, I've taken a bit more time.
No, we're good then.
Yeah, good. The advisory board professional themselves, we're seeing them being involved in multiple organisations. So 36% of advisory board professionals are also belonging to like the governance board organisation for their region, like the Institute of Directors or Singapore Institute of Directors or AICD or the Governance Institute. So they're being involved in multiple communities. And what we're seeing from that is people are talking about what is my governance board portfolio. They're saying, what's my board portfolio? And then choosing and managing their own risk appetite about when is it that I'm on a governance board versus when I'm on a governance board, and mixing up their portfolio with both of those things. When they're talking about their board portfolio, they're talking about both.
Integrated, yeah. And that's very much what when we are talking to people who are looking to work this way, it's how do they build, I picture it like a funnel with different buckets sort of tipping in what fills your bucket.
Yeah.
And how do you get your work? Some of it will be governance boards, some would be advisory, some might be interim, some might be other either paying or non-paying activities that you do to use up your time.
Yeah.
And so that's the link for us. People are really interested in this as part of a broader portfolio of work.
Exactly. So when we look at the advisory board professionals, 60% of our community, as an example, are portfolio professionals. And they'll do a mix of advisory boards, governance boards, consulting, interim, mentoring, investment, playing golf, right? So they'll do multiple things. And so when we're seeing maturity cycles when they might be saying it's not one or the other, it can be one and then the other. So they might be doing an interim role, which works at a level. At the end of that interim role, they then shift that relationship into an advisory board. So that the job is done, but then they're able to then follow through and say, let's follow through to make sure you maintain your investment. We won't get caught up in the detail anymore. So we're not getting drawn inside the organisation. We're going to lift the conversation up into an advisory board capacity.
Okay.
So consulting is doing the same thing. So you've got a maturity cycle in the relationship with a client. And I think that's a really interesting evolution in those relationships, as well as the evolution of the advisory board relationship with the client. There's been a shift too in the numbers of engagement. So for the last 3 reports, it's been consistent that people's portfolios are between 5 to 6 engagements at any given time. We're now seeing a bigger range, and this is part of the thing about the deepening of the relationships of chairs in particular, or they'll have between 2 and 6 engagements at any given time. And so you might have individuals that might have like an interim executive role or a consulting piece or a day job where they're saying, I'm doing that. And then I'll have the side gig, I'll have an advisory board on the side. Or I'm going to be, instead of running around trying to do lots of engagements, I'm going to have a deeper, trusted relationship with a client and then have a longer term relationship with that client. Yeah.
The numbers for pure governance boards, good practice would say you really can't have more than 4. 3 or 4 is probably ideal. So because of the workload and the timing, they have to happen in the month, and all the things people on the call will understand. So, that's that. You can have a few more advisory, or you can have a mix of a couple of governance boards and some advisory boards, and yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Where we're seeing a remuneration and engagement, 70% of engagements are paid, 20% pro bono. We know there's a very giving nature in the advisory board profession, and 8% equity. I thought I'd finished this study by now, but I haven't. We're continuing to look at the role of equity and advice and potential conflicts of interest. So watch this space as we continue to look at the ethical boundaries around equity-based engagement.
And you were saying there was so much data from this report that you're going to sort of have a couple of breakout reports. Is that right?
Yes, there's
Yeah.
more to come. There's more to come. We've got so much data now that it can't be just captured in one document. The best practice framework, though, is still the cornerstone. So we've got the best practice framework. We've got the code of ethics that really bind the frameworks of good practice in advisory boards. So it's freely available. Both those documents now. The code of ethics is now also publicly available on the website too. But you can use that QR code if you're interested in the ABF 101, which has just recently been updated as well.
Oh, thank you for that nice gift for everyone. We'll also be sending it around. So if you haven't got your phone nearby to get that, we will be sharing that. Gosh, we've got some time. What I wanted us to sort of start to address, I'm really interested. You've been traveling around the world, and there's a lot happening in the world. What are you feeling and seeing in this space around governance? I was particularly interested when we spoke earlier. You sort of said the Middle East is thinking about it differently, and we would traditionally probably look at, say, a UK or America. Are they the same as us? So I'm just really interested in how the rest of the world's viewing the advisory frameworks.
I think where we're looking at regions like Australia, but also in the UK, European zone, but modern governance is tricky because we are over-governed, and the amount of regulations that we have is constraining governance. And it gets really tricky being a director. I think emerging economies are really embracing advisory boards faster in some ways because there's a level of self-governance while they don't have sufficient regulations. They're needing to self-regulate. And so advisory boards are really becoming a good way to be able to adopt a modern governance approach and scale their governance with the absence of regulations. Potentially, their models of governance could be quite different in the future because they're doing this early on. And maybe there's an opportunity to rethink governance in those environments where is there a way to be able to use technology rather than regulations to be able to manage this process of those that are being regulated and how they're being regulated by regulators. So there's some really interesting thinking going on around the world about how to do that rather than writing rules. Actually, how is self-disclosure going to be able to help manage an automated approach and real-time data between the regulator rather than building regulations, they're actually building technology and information flow between the two. Advisory boards are potentially going to be a really good way to be able to continue to support that kind of thinking. It's still really early days, Jacinta, in that thinking. And I'll be really interested if anyone's got a point of view around it. Don't have to agree with me, but I think it's interesting that governance will potentially be different in these emerging economies.
And, no reason why it shouldn't. It doesn't say what we've got's perfect. I would suggest that everyone who's on a board reading 1,000 pages in prep for their meeting would think there's got to be a better way to do this. The question I want to get to, because we've got an audience here that are looking at a portfolio, Chris, how do the people who are on the call and watching today, how do they better prepare themselves, whether it be their resume or the tools, and you've given away a lovely sort of, some guidance there and the free tools. But what can people do to get on advisory boards? That's probably what the number one question that would come out of today.
Look, the data still shows, and it may not continue to be this way, but relationships matter. Referrals is still the biggest area of opportunities being raised. The other, and so managing those relationships, having conversations with them, be curious. Your curiosity is your number one strength as a professional in this space. Be genuinely interested in what other people are doing, not just thinking about, I'm here to sell my time. It's about, we know people are going, what is my value? Who's going to value that? What am I deeply, genuinely curious about, and where I want to contribute my value, and drive those conversations and look for those opportunities to contribute rather than looking for a gig. So the conversation is about, what are you doing? If there's any way I can support you, I'd like to do that, because it may be the model is interim executive. The model might be an advisory board, might be a governance board. It may be none of those things. They might need something else or nothing at all. But having those conversations and be open-minded, because the market generally still doesn't know. They're not looking for an advisory board. They're just looking for help or looking for a way to be able to address a need. An advisory board is just a construct, right? And the structure always follows purpose.
And we would sort of advise people as well, you have to be really crisp and clear on what you're offering to market. And that level of self-agency, it's on you to sort of say, this is the skill I give, and this is the depth, and rather than this generalist, where we started that generalist conversation, this is a problem I could solve. This is what, something that you're knee deep in, that I have some real currency in. But the articulation of that is particularly hard to get really clear cut through. And so when people get that part, I don't doubt there's people that could give great advice and are passionate about an area, but you actually have to be able to demonstrate to someone, where's the value, and what if they're putting money on the line, why you as opposed to anyone else, because I don't think anyone's going to, walk in and say, we've been waiting for you, so there's, I think for people sort of preparing, how do I do this? The same message probably applies. Be really clear on what you can deliver and what value you can bring.
Yeah, and have the conversation, and not, if you approach it in a consulting, you're going to get a consulting gig. Consulting is very different to an advisory boards. Advisory boards is a thinking system. And so being curious about it, going, what kind of voices do you need around this to be able to navigate this, but also navigate beyond this? And so you're not going in there, rushing in there, saying, I can provide the answers for you, because none of us have been in the future. We're all making it up. We all need to be thinking differently about the future. And we've got to de-risk the way that we think ourselves, because we have knowledge redundancy. All of us have knowledge redundancy. So having a collaborative way of thinking, I think will create, maybe going slower to go faster later on.
I want to really be conscious of time, and so we might wrap up. I think a couple of things that stood out for me, this new definition of modern governance that you spoke about, that it's an integrated system rather than one way of doing governance, I think is really interesting. The massive growth from 1.3 to 9.8 in sort of a 6-year period, crazy. The corporates, the growth of that corporate piece really stood out for me. That big generalist, I think the market's going to love to hear this sort of generalist role of that chair. I think I really want to spend some more time thinking about that. The shift to longer tenure, that 10-year, if you're in that role for 10 years, that's quite a unique way to think about how you contribute. Everyone's at this stage because they're thinking differently about how they work, and longevity overplays it, etc. So how do people lock in for those longer periods, I think is really interesting for us to all sort of keep thinking through. And, I leave it by, I think that evolution from governance board to an integrated governance system, I think is the thing that stood out for me the most from this year's
Yeah.
data.
Thanks, Jacinta. And
Yeah.
you know, the narrative, just to close off on that,
Yeah.
governance becomes everybody's responsibility.
Mm.
And this really helps directors, I think, to reshape their own personal liability.
Mm.
But yes, it's exciting times, but we've got a lot of work ahead of us, Jacinta.
That's the fun. Thank you. Everyone on the call will follow up. You'll get an email. You'll be able to sort of review if there were some parts to the session that you wanted to rethink or watch again. Louise, thank you for always being so kind and willing to share this fabulous data. We feel very lucky to have the relationship with the advisory board, and it's we really appreciate it. So thank you. Thank you for attending. We'll get to you with the next webinar. We love presenting these and just sharing with you our network, some of the latest thinking out there. This is literally the latest, 3 weeks off the press. Thank you. Enjoy your day. See you later.
Thanks, Jacinta.